The morning was crisp, and the sky above Malta stretched in hues of pale blue and gold. The islanders stirred from their homes, their daily routines unfolding in rhythm with the gentle lapping of the Mediterranean waves. Among the community was Publius, the island's chief official, a man respected not only for his authority, but for his fairness and wisdom. Publius lived in a large, modestly adorned house near the village's heart, where he often greeted travelers, tended to disputes, and ensured the well-being of his people. On this particular morning, the peace of the island was disrupted by a commotion near the shore. Fishermen hauling in their nets suddenly froze, their eyes fixed on the horizon. A broken ship was caught in the tide, its splintered frame pushed toward the beach. Figures clung to planks and wreckage, desperate to survive. "Shipwreck!" one of the fishermen cried, dropping his net. Publius, hearing the commotion, stepped outside his home, his brow furrowed with concern as the messenger breathlessly reported the events at the beach. "Gather the villagers," Publius instructed. "We will bring them in before the cold claims them." The scene at the shore was chaotic. Survivors stumbled onto the sand, drenched and shivering, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. Among them was a man named Paul, a prisoner being transported to Rome along with other prisoners, sailors, and soldiers. Paul's chains clinked softly as he helped another man to his feet. Despite his bound hands, his demeanor radiated calm and strength. "Everyone will be safe," Paul assured the others. "The Lord has brought us through the storm." Publius approached, flanked by villagers carrying blankets and baskets of food. He raised his hands to quiet the crowd. "You are safe now," he said in a firm but kind voice. "We will take you in and see to your needs. You have survived the sea. Let us see you survive the cold." The survivors, too weary to speak, gratefully accepted the islanders' hospitality. Paul glanced at Publius, their eyes meeting briefly, and nodded in silent thanks. Publius led the effort to settle the survivors. Fires were built along the beach, and the villagers worked tirelessly to provide food and warmth. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the islanders began to hear fragments of the survivors' story. Paul sat by one of the fires, explaining their ordeal to a group of villagers. "We set out from Crete, but were caught in a storm that raged for weeks. The ship was battered, the cargo lost, and the crew nearly abandoned hope. But I was told by an angel of the Lord that none of us would perish. He has brought us here to this island for a purpose." The villagers listened intently, their eyes wide with curiosity. Publius, standing a short distance away, watched Paul with interest. There was something about this man that set him apart, a confidence and humility that Publius couldn't quite place. As night fell, Publius invited Paul and a few others to his home. The large, warm room was lit by flickering oil lamps. The smell of roasted fish and fresh bread filled the air. Publius's household worked quickly to ensure that their unexpected guests were comfortable. Paul, seated across from Publius, looked around the room with gratitude. "Your hospitality is remarkable," Paul said. "Not all would show such kindness to strangers." Publius smiled faintly. "It is our way to care for those in need. But tell me, who are you, and why were you at sea in such dangerous conditions?" Paul shared his story, speaking of his mission to Rome, his faith in the Lord, and the journey that had brought him to Malta. Publius listened carefully, his mind racing with questions about this man who spoke with such conviction. The first night on the island ended with the survivors safely settled. Publius, as he prepared to retire, stood by the window of his room, gazing out at the stars. His thoughts lingered on Paul's words. He had heard of the God of Israel, but had never given it much thought. Yet something about Paul's calm confidence made him wonder if there was more to the man's faith than mere stories. Publius resolved to learn more, but for now, his focus was on ensuring the well-being of the survivors. The days ahead would bring challenges and revelations that would test his understanding of kindness, faith, and the meaning of true leadership. The shipwreck survivors began to settle into their temporary lives on the island of Malta. The islanders, led by Publius, welcomed them with remarkable warmth, ensuring they had food, shelter, and a place to heal. Publius's household became the center of these efforts, and the chief himself often visited the survivors, checking on their well-being. Among the survivors, Paul quickly stood out. Though his chains marked him as a prisoner, his presence radiated calm and wisdom. He spoke with authority, yet his humility and kindness made him approachable. Publius observed this and found himself drawn to Paul, intrigued by the man's resilience and faith. One afternoon, as Publius walked among the makeshift shelters where the survivors were staying, he noticed Paul sitting by a fire, speaking to a small group. The villagers and survivors listened intently as Paul shared stories of his faith and the God he served. Publius approached quietly, catching the tail end of Paul's words. "Even in the storm, God's hand was upon us," Paul said. "He brought us here for a purpose, though we may not yet see it." Publius cleared his throat and the group turned to him. "You speak with conviction, Paul," he said. "But do you truly believe your God led you here intentionally, to a remote island far from your destination?" Paul met Publius's gaze, his expression steady. "I believe that God's plans are higher than our understanding," he replied. "We were brought here, not by chance, but by design. And perhaps," he added with a faint smile, "it is not just for our sake." Publius raised an eyebrow, intrigued but unconvinced. "We shall see, Paul," he said. "For now, let us focus on ensuring your people recover from their ordeal." Over the next few days, Publius observed Paul more closely. He noticed how the man tended to the wounded, offering words of encouragement and prayers that seemed to bring a sense of peace. Paul's influence among the survivors and villagers alike was undeniable, and Publius found himself both impressed and puzzled. One evening, as the stars glittered over the island, Publius invited Paul to his home for a meal. The large, warm room was filled with the aroma of roasted fish and bread. Publius's household worked diligently to ensure everything was perfect, eager to honor their guest. As they ate, Publius asked, "Tell me, Paul, what drives you? You speak of your God as though he is always near, yet you have suffered greatly. Why remain so loyal to a faith that has brought you chains?" Paul paused, his expression thoughtful. "It is not chains that bind me, Publius," he said. "It is love. Love for a God who gave everything for me. My suffering is temporary, but his purpose is eternal. That is why I trust him, even in trials." Publius was silent for a moment, absorbing Paul's words. There was a sincerity in his tone that was hard to ignore. Though Publius was a man of reason and authority, he felt a stirring within him, a faint whisper of something he couldn't quite name. The next day, Publius's duties called him away from the survivors, but he couldn't shake the conversations he'd had with Paul. As he oversaw the distribution of food and resources among the villagers, his mind kept returning to the prisoner who spoke like a free man. Later that evening, as he stood on the shore watching the waves, Publius thought of the strange twists of fate that had brought the shipwrecked strangers to his island. He wondered if there was truth to Paul's belief that their arrival was no accident. Was it possible that the storm, the wreckage, and even this gathering of strangers and islanders had a purpose beyond what he could see? As the days went on, Publius found himself seeking Paul's counsel more often. Though he didn't fully understand the man's faith, he couldn't deny its impact. Paul's words carried a weight that lingered, challenging Publius to look beyond his role as a leader and consider deeper questions about life, purpose, and the divine. The days passed steadily on the island of Malta, and the bond between the survivors and the islanders grew stronger. Publius, always attentive to his duties as the island's chief, had come to know Paul well. Though Paul was a prisoner, there was a quiet authority about him that Publius couldn't ignore. The villagers began to whisper about Paul's kindness, and some even remarked on his words about faith and purpose. But within Publius's household, a shadow loomed. His father, an elderly man beloved by the family and the villagers, had fallen gravely ill. Fever burned through his frail body, and no remedy seemed to ease his suffering. The household staff moved quietly, their faces drawn with worry, while Publius spent long hours at his father's bedside, helpless to ease his pain. One afternoon, Paul visited Publius's home, as he often did. When he entered, the usually vibrant atmosphere was subdued, the air heavy with tension. Publius greeted him, his face lined with exhaustion. "My father grows weaker by the day," Publius admitted, his voice tinged with despair. "We've tried every remedy we know, but nothing has worked." Paul looked at him, his expression calm yet filled with compassion. "May I see him?" he asked. Publius hesitated. He had come to respect Paul's wisdom and kindness, but this was his father, his family's heart. Yet something in Paul's steady gaze made him nod. "Come," he said, leading Paul to the room where his father lay. The sight was heartbreaking. Publius's father lay on the bed, his breathing shallow, his face pale and glistening with sweat. Publius stood by the door, his hand gripping the frame as if to steady himself. Paul approached the bed, kneeling beside the ailing man. He placed a hand gently on his shoulder and began to pray. "Lord," Paul said, his voice low but filled with conviction, "you are the great healer. You see this man suffering, and you know the hearts of those who love him. Show your mercy here, Lord, and restore him to health. Let this house witness your power and goodness." As Paul prayed, the room seemed to grow still. The tension that had gripped the air lifted, replaced by a quiet peace. Publius watched, his skepticism battling with hope. Suddenly, his father stirred. His eyes fluttered open and his breathing steadied. A faint color returned to his cheeks. "Father?" Publius said, stepping closer. "Can you hear me?" His father turned his head, his gaze clear for the first time in days. "I feel better," he whispered, his voice weak but steady. "The fever, it's gone." The household erupted in a mixture of awe and joy. Servants rushed to bring water and food, while Publius knelt by his father's side, overcome with emotion. He turned to Paul, his expression a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "What have you done?" Publius asked. "How could this be possible?" Paul smiled, standing. "It was not I who healed him," he said. "It was the Lord, whose power knows no bounds. He sees our needs and answers in his time." News of the healing spread quickly across the island. Villagers came to Publius's home, bringing their sick and injured in hopes of experiencing the same miraculous touch. Paul and his companions prayed for them, and one by one they were healed. The islanders were astonished, and their respect for Paul grew into something deeper, an acknowledgement of the God he served. Publius, too, was shaken. For all his authority and wisdom, he had never witnessed anything like this. He began to question the beliefs he had held all his life. Could it be true, as Paul claimed, that there was one God, a God who cared deeply for his creation and intervened in their lives? That night, Publius sat alone under the stars, his mind racing with thoughts. Paul's words echoed in his ears, challenging everything he thought he knew. Faith begins with a step, Paul had said, a willingness to seek and trust. Publius looked up at the heavens, the vast expanse making him feel small. For the first time in his life, he whispered a prayer, unsure if anyone was listening. "If you are real," he said quietly, "show me the truth." The days after his father's miraculous recovery brought a profound change in Publius. Though he continued his duties as chief of Malta with the same diligence, a new restlessness had taken hold of him. The islanders now spoke of Paul with awe, many believing he was a holy man sent by a divine power. Everywhere Publius went, he overheard people recounting the healings and Paul's words about his God. But Publius remained conflicted. While he couldn't deny what he had witnessed, his rational mind struggled to accept the idea of one God with such power and care for humanity. Questions swirled in his heart, unanswered and persistent. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Publius invited Paul to his home once more. The two sat on the terrace, the gentle sound of waves in the distance filling the silence. "Paul," Publius began, his tone contemplative, "I cannot ignore what I've seen. My father's recovery, the healings of the villagers. There is something extraordinary at work here. But I don't understand. If your God is so powerful, why does he allow suffering at all?" Paul leaned back, his expression patient. "That's a question many have asked, Publius. Suffering is not easy to understand, but it can serve a purpose. It humbles us, reminds us of our dependence on God, and often leads us to a deeper faith. Even in pain, God is present, working for good in ways we cannot always see." Publius frowned, his mind grappling with the idea. "And yet," he said, "it feels unfair. Why would a loving God allow storms, shipwrecks, and sickness to plague his people?" Paul smiled gently. "Even storms can bring blessings, as they brought us here to Malta. Your hospitality has been a light in the darkness, Publius. Perhaps the storm wasn't just about us. It was about bringing hope and truth to your people." Publius was silent for a long moment, gazing at the stars above. Paul's words resonated, but they didn't erase the doubts in his heart. "I'm not sure I can have faith, as you do, Paul," he admitted. "It feels unreachable." "Faith is not about having all the answers," Paul replied. "It's about taking a step, even when you don't see the whole path. God meets us where we are, Publius. You don't need to have everything figured out, just a willingness to seek him." The conversation lingered in Publius's mind over the following days. He began to notice the small acts of kindness and gratitude among the survivors and villagers, inspired by Paul's teachings. A fisherman who had once been quick-tempered now shared his catch with those in need. A young mother, healed of a fever, spoke joyfully of her gratitude to the God Paul served. Publius couldn't deny that something was changing, not just in the people around him, but within himself. He found himself drawn to moments of quiet reflection, wondering if Paul's God was reaching out to him as well. One afternoon, a villager approached Publius with a request. "Chief, my wife has been ill for weeks. Do you think Paul could pray for her?" Publius nodded. "I will ask him," he said, his tone thoughtful. But remember, it is not Paul who heals, it is his God." The villager hesitated, then smiled. "If Paul's God is as powerful as they say, then perhaps there's hope for my wife." Publius sought out Paul and relayed the villager's request. Together, they went to the man's home, where Paul prayed over the woman. Within days, she recovered, her strength returning as if the illness had never touched her. The healing only deepened the islanders' reverence for Paul and his God. Publius, witnessing these events, felt the weight of his questions pressing harder. He began to wonder if his doubts were less about logic and more about fear. Fear of surrendering control, of placing his trust in something beyond himself. Late one night, as the island lay quiet under a blanket of stars, Publius found himself standing on the same shore where the shipwreck survivors had first arrived. The waves lapped gently at the rocks, their rhythm soothing yet persistent. Publius closed his eyes and let out a long breath. "If you are real," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "show me, help me understand." The island of Malta remained a place of quiet beauty, but for Publius, an unease lingered beneath the surface of his calm exterior. The conversations with Paul, the miracles he had witnessed, and the changes in his people were undeniable, yet he still hesitated to surrender fully to the faith Paul spoke of. It was as if the last piece of a puzzle was missing, and Publius couldn't see where it fit. One day, a storm rolled over the island. The skies turned gray, and a harsh wind swept through the village. Publius stood at his window, watching the rain lash against the glass. The weather mirrored the turmoil in his heart, a relentless tug of war between doubt and the pull of something greater. The storm kept him indoors, giving him time to reflect. His thoughts returned to Paul's words. Faith begins with a step, a willingness to seek and trust. Publius had seen what faith could do, how it had healed his father, brought hope to the villagers, and transformed lives. But still, he wrestled with his pride and fear of the unknown. Later that evening, a servant rushed into Publius's study. "Chief, it's your son!" the servant exclaimed, his voice filled with urgency. Publius's heart sank. His young son, only 8 years old, had been feverish for days. Though Publius had hoped it was a passing illness, the boy's condition had worsened. He hurried to his son's bedside, where the child lay pale and shivering, his breathing shallow. The healer Publius had summoned earlier stood nearby, his expression grim. "I've done all I can," the healer said. "The fever has taken hold. I'm sorry." Publius sat beside his son, his hands trembling as he brushed damp hair from the boy's forehead. A wave of helplessness crashed over him, heavier than any storm he had ever faced. He thought of Paul and the miracles he had seen, the power that seemed to flow from Paul's prayers. "Send for Paul," Publius said, his voice breaking. "Tell him I need him here, now." Paul arrived swiftly, his expression calm but concerned. He knelt beside the boy and placed a hand on his chest. "Lord," Paul prayed, his voice steady, "you are the giver of life and the healer of all wounds. Show your mercy here and restore this child. Let this family see your power and love." Publius watched intently, his heart pounding. He wanted to believe, but doubt still whispered in the back of his mind. What if the prayer didn't work? What if his son was beyond saving? Then, to his astonishment, the boy stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, and he looked around the room with clear, alert eyes. "Father," the boy said weakly. Tears filled Publius's eyes as he embraced his son. "You're awake," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're going to be all right." Paul stood, his expression serene. "Your son has been healed," he said, "not by me, but by the power of the Lord. Give thanks to him, for his mercy is great." That night, as the storm subsided and the skies cleared, Publius stood alone on the terrace of his home. He gazed up at the stars, his heart full of gratitude and awe. The doubts that had plagued him for so long began to fade, replaced by a quiet certainty. "I don't have all the answers," Publius whispered, "but I know you are real. Thank you for saving my son and for showing me the truth." It was a moment of surrender, a step of faith that Publius had resisted for so long. He didn't need to understand everything. He only needed to trust. In the days that followed, Publius shared his story with the villagers, speaking openly of the miracle that had saved his son. His newfound faith inspired others to seek out Paul, eager to learn more about the God who had brought light to their island. Publius, once a leader focused solely on the practical needs of his people, now became a shepherd of their spiritual growth as well. The days following the miraculous healing of Publius's son were filled with joy and renewed purpose across Malta. Villagers gathered daily to hear Paul speak, their hearts open to the message he carried. Publius, now a man transformed by his faith, became an advocate for the teachings Paul shared. His role as the island's chief took on new meaning, not just as a leader of the people, but as a shepherd guiding them toward truth and hope. One evening, as the sun set over the rugged shores of Malta, Paul and Publius walked along the beach. The waves lapped gently at their feet, and the air was filled with the scent of salt and seaweed. Publius broke the silence. "Paul, I never imagined my life would change so drastically," he said. "Your God, our God, has shown me a love and power I cannot deny. I feel as though I have been given a new purpose." Paul nodded, his face serene. "The Lord has called you, Publius, as he calls us all. You've seen his hand at work. Now you are a light for your people, a testament to what faith can do." Publius smiled, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "It is humbling, Paul. I thought I was strong because of my position, but it was in my weakest moment that I truly found strength." As time passed, Publius became a central figure in spreading the faith across Malta. He opened his home as a place of gathering and learning, where Paul taught villagers about the love and grace of God. The islanders, inspired by the miracles they had witnessed and the teachings they now embraced, began to live with a renewed sense of unity and purpose. Even those who had been skeptical at first couldn't deny the changes in their community. Quarrels diminished, generosity flourished, and a spirit of kindness seemed to touch every corner of the island. Publius's leadership reflected the transformation, as he governed with humility and compassion, seeking wisdom through prayer and guidance from the teachings of Paul. The time eventually came for Paul and the other survivors to leave Malta. A ship, repaired and ready, awaited them at the shore. The villagers gathered to bid them farewell, their hearts heavy with gratitude and sadness. Publius stood at the forefront, his son at his side, both of them alive and thriving because of the faith they had discovered. As Paul prepared to board the ship, Publius grasped his arm. "You've changed this island forever, Paul," he said, "and you've changed me. I will never forget what you've taught us." Paul placed a hand on Publius's shoulder. "It was not I, but the Lord who worked here. Remember that his presence is with you always. Lead your people in his ways, and Malta will continue to flourish." The ship sailed away, and the villagers watched until it disappeared beyond the horizon. Publius turned to his people, his voice strong yet filled with emotion. Paul's journey may take him elsewhere, but what he has left us, faith, hope, and love, will remain. Let us honor his time here by living out what we have learned. The crowd cheered, their spirits lifted despite the bittersweet farewell. Publius knew the responsibility before him was great, but he felt ready. His faith had become his foundation, and he was determined to lead with the same grace and courage Paul had shown. Years later, the story of Paul's time on Malta and Publius's transformation continued to inspire the island. Children grew up hearing tales of the shipwreck, the miracles, and the faith that had taken root in their land. Publius's leadership became a legacy of kindness and humility, his name remembered as a man who embraced a greater purpose. In the end, Publius's journey was not about a single moment or miracle, but about the enduring power of faith to transform lives. His story became a testament to the truth that even in the midst of storms, whether on the sea or in the heart, God's light could guide the way to redemption and hope. The end.